Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. Some of our listeners may have noticed that we just launched a new podcast. It's called Uniting America with John Wood Jr. And who else do I have on the podcast today to talk about this show but John Wood Jr., the man, the myth, the legend. John, you've had a busy couple weeks. I saw you on Fox News. I saw your op-ed in USA Today. I saw you getting tweeted out by Elon Musk. How you doing out there?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. It's good to be back on the home court on the Braver Angels podcast with
That's right.
my brother Ciaran O'Connor. So the boys are back, yeah, man. I've been busy plunging into the conversation and launched the new podcast to a real splash. Wasn't really wasn't really expecting to stir the pot quite the way we did. But it's good. You know, things are off to a big start, and the message of bringing Americans together and building a house united is getting out there. So at the end of the day, that's really what matters.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into some of the controversy stirred by your first episode, why don't you take a moment to reflect and tell our listeners a little bit about the vision for the show? What sets this apart from every other political podcast that folks can find out there?
Yeah, man. Well, thank you for the setup. There are a whole lot of political podcasts out there with people talking about politics and people berating other people who are talking about politics. So much of the problem in our discourse, of course, is the fact that everybody's trying to own each other, everybody's trying to destroy each other, so on and so forth. And when you get big names in the conversation, you know, the temptation to sort of dunk on each other or have them dunk on other people is pretty hard for people in the business, so to speak, to resist. But at Uniting America, we're looking to do a very different thing. The idea is to challenge people who are important figures in the world of politics or media or academia or culture to get their perspectives on issues, to see where it is they disagree with people, but to also challenge them to humanize the people that they disagree with, right? So in the conversations I have, you're going to see me, you know, sharing some of my own perspectives, but really focusing in on straw manning, I'm sorry, rather steel manning, or in the words of my friend Angel Eduardo, star manning, people's points of view who have a different sort of opinion from the individual that I'm talking to at any given moment. And so if I'm speaking to a conservative, I'm going to want to really sort of lean into just the good faith starting point of people on the progressive side of the aisle. If I'm speaking to somebody who's a liberal, I'm going to want to really lean in to why conservatives see things in the way they do for reasons other than the idea that, oh, every Republican is just racist or a bigot or this, that, or the other, because that's the kind of, you know, simplistic nature of the kind of conversations that we usually have in politics. So that's a pattern that we just have to break. And I think honestly that it makes for conversations that are deeper, more challenging, and that, you know, make people think a little bit harder about the topics that we're discussing, and and about the people who hold those other opinions. So that's really the vision of the podcast here, Ciaran, to try and challenge people to be empathetic towards those who disagree with them at the highest level of our discourse. And so that's what we're aiming at.
Hmm. Yeah, and for those listeners who may not be up on the lingo, of course,
Mhm.
straw straw manning refers to creating a false representation
Right.
of your opponent's argument to paint it in the least charitable light. Star manning, another phrase which was popularized by Angel Eduardo, means engaging with the most charitable interpretation of your opponent's argument. And so that's what John means when he uses that concept, because I think it's a nice symbolic way to think about some of the modes of conversation that we seek to encourage at Braver Angels, on the Braver Angels podcast, and now with this new show, Uniting America with John Wood Jr. So you talked a little bit about the vision. I think it's really exciting. talk a little bit about the first episode, which I should note listeners
Mhm.
can find wherever they listen to their podcasts. They can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, what have you. And for those who want to see John's pretty mug, you can check out YouTube and watch the video version. Tell us a little bit about the first episode, who the guest was, why you chose the guest, and ultimately what went down.
Yes, sir. Well, so our first guest was Sam Harris. Sam Harris, very prominent public intellectual, podcaster, host of the Making Sense podcast, philosopher, neuroscientist. I mean, Sam is one of the most prominent public thinkers in America, if not the world, really. I'm a person who's had a long relationship with Sam as a listener to his podcast. Didn't start communicating with him directly until a bit more recently, but I'm a longtime admirer of Sam. He's somebody who has a reputation for being a very clear thinker who tries to not get bogged down by sort of tribalism in our social discourse. But in recent times, Sam has found himself at the nexus of some high profile disagreements and controversies, particularly over whether or not to publicly debate about issues such as voter fraud in the 2020 election and the efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccine or treatments, alternative treatments put forward by some folks, including my friend Brett Weinstein, such as ivermectin, right? Sam was a person who considered it to be very much irresponsible to debate these things on the cusp of the 2020 election in the case of voter fraud and during the heat of the COVID-19 pandemic. Sam tended to sort of amplify the mainstream sort of consensus of established experts with respect to the safety of the vaccine, the wisdom in trusting it, and in seeking to spread it as far and wide as we could as a means of safeguarding the health of the American people. But other people had deep skepticism about the science. And so the controversy that we came into this conversation sort of trailing behind us with respect to the way a lot of people were looking at Sam Harris was a lot of people saw him as somebody who was contradicting his previously stated principles, his commitments to free speech and intellectual discourse, because there were certain topics that he didn't really want to debate with his high profile detractors during the midst of these hot issues. And so my argument to Sam was not that he didn't have very good reason to be concerned about the spread of disinformation, given what he believed to be true about the science, but rather that we miss an opportunity if it is in fact the case that Sam had the right sort of understanding of where the reliable information actually lay in the conversation at the time, that we miss an opportunity by not engaging with the people who disagree with us on these points or that disagreed with him on these points, um, to inform people who are following those with whom we disagree um, of the information that could actually be useful to them because we, in breaking off our chains of communication, uh, basically close the door to any pathway by which people can actually hear things outside of their echo chamber. Sam didn't want
Right.
to engage, yeah, Sam didn't want to engage Brett Weinstein and others because he thought that they were spreading information that was dangerous and irresponsible. But even if that was true, my argument simply was that if you don't have the conversation, you can't reach the people who are following those folks. And what good is the truth if it doesn't get to the people who need it? So that was the conversation in essence that I wanted to have with Sam. We had a very good conversation. We went deep on a lot of different points surrounding this question. When do you talk to people? How do we persuade one another of what's true? And what's the role of friendship and building out, sort of networks of trust that can allow us to transcend the divide? What wound up happening
Right.
though was interesting because there's a fella who it seems from highlights to be a decent guy. We've had some respectful communication. His name is Alexandros Marinos, who took but he took about 5 minutes or so of our conversation and tweeted it out, drawing attention to one particular quote where Sam basically said something along the lines of if the virus had impacted people differently, let's say that it was more dangerous to children than it would have been to elderly people. I'm paraphrasing here, but that people would have taken the virus more seriously, right? And that in quote, in that sense, we were unlucky, right? In that sense, we were unlucky that the virus didn't have, sort of an impact that would have made people reckon with the science more seriously and therefore not indulge misinformation as much. And that quote was one that a lot of people jumped on as evidence of the fact that Sam Harris, in point of fact, would have been totally fine with kids being killed by this virus
Right.
as long
Exactly.
as as long as it allowed the government to sort of get its policy across. And
Well, talk
so, yeah,
about talk about straw manning. I mean, that's an example right there, right? Taking somebody's words out of context to sort of set them up to be
mm,
a monster, or someone who wants children to die, and firing off a tweet. Before we
right.
jump into sort of that conversation, because I think it's interesting, I just want to touch on sort of the larger substance of the debate you were having with Sam about the wisdom and safety of debating life or death issues in
Mm,
which, the spread of what Sam and many people believe is misinformation could have deadly consequences. And this is an issue that I think we wrestle with a lot at Braver Angels. When we had a debate on the 2020 election, people said, it's ridiculous that folks would say that the election was stolen from Trump, and to give these people a platform is to somehow endorse that view. We took a different line because we felt, as you stated before, that really engagement is the only way to sort of build trust and
mm,
reach people who might fall prey to false narratives. I wonder, though, in the COVID example, if you could demonstrate that the impact of having the conversation resulted in fewer people taking the vaccine,
mm.
and you do believe that more people taking the vaccine leads to less people getting sick and dying. Obviously, there's no way you could really truly measure the impact of the conversation. But I imagine, in Sam's estimation, he has such a broad audience
Mm.
that there's an interest in reaching the vaccine skeptics who might come to the podcast because they agree with Brett Weinstein, and through that get exposed to Sam Harris's arguments. But there's also a broader audience who might be unsure of whom to trust, or generally tend to trust the mainstream. But because Brett is such a seemingly informed and eloquent speaker, start to see the waters as muddied a little bit and
Mm.
say, well, I don't know. I mean, Sam had some studies, but Brett had some studies, and both these guys seem pretty smart and they know what they're talking about. And maybe
Yeah.
the vaccine isn't as safe as I thought. And so I just wonder, as a thought experiment, if you could conclusively prove that having that conversation, in which misinformation, one could argue, was given equal footing with more mainstream, scientifically verifiable information in a way where it's very hard to fact check in real time. If you could prove that that actually led to fewer people taking the vaccine, more people getting sick, would that then lead you to say that the actual consequences, the impact, outweighs the more conceptual and fundamental need to have these conversations? Because I imagine that's
Mm.
in some ways the crux of the argument, because Sam does, I think, philosophically agree with you about the power and the necessity of conversation. But I wonder if in the COVID example, he's
Yeah.
taking more of a utilitarian perspective and saying that in this instance, he actually thinks, more people could die if he has this conversation.
Oh, well, yeah, and so that's why I empathize very strongly with Sam's, concern, of course. I mean, given what he believed to be true about the science, he considered it a matter of life and death, and so, I don't take any issue with anybody who disagrees with Sam on the substance of whether, the science was right or wrong or to what degree in either direction. My defense of Sam Harris has been on the basis of what I consider to be his motivations. I think that they're basically good because I think that Sam was worried about endangering people. And I said to Sam in the conversation, I said I think that it was particularly in the moment in a moment in which, the consequences were real time of having these conversations, right? I considered it, not illogical, that he would sort of, take a conservative posture and say, you know what, I'm not going to take the chance of making this problem worse by elevating, points of view that I think could be damaging. In the moment at which the situation was worse, um, at its worst, I can understand that as a rational point of view. But here's the thing, though. I think that how we structure these conversations matters. I
Mm,
think that if there are two parties coming from a place of good faith who also do have the commitment and the capacity for a deep dive into the information that is available to us, when people reason together in a deep and thorough manner, with a willingness not just to try and beat each other in a debate, that can't be the point of it, but rather to identify what we definitely know, what we definitely don't know, and what we might be unsure about in an ongoing sort of dialectical process that allows us to bring in other experts, other authorities, and really get clear on just where the strongest evidence lies and what direction it points. Then I think it's possible for us to actually have conversations that reliably deliver us somewhere closer to what's actually true, or at least to what the most likely sort of scenario of truth happens to be. Sam didn't feel like it was, likely to be the case that him and Brett Weinstein, for instance, could accomplish that. But what I expressed to him was that that was the hope that for my part and for others as well. Sam Harris is famous for having conversations with people like Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein and Ben Shapiro and others that just went for hours and hours across multiple episodes with hundreds of
right.
thousands and even millions of people sort of following very complex discussions. I understand why Sam didn't want to have those conversations this time around, but it nevertheless remains the case that as a I think in part as a consequence of this, many people, not just on account of Sam, but on account of the way in which dissenting voices felt themselves being shut out of the conversation on social media, in the mainstream media, perhaps in universities and other settings, people have lost their trust in much of the mainstream medical establishment, and certainly the media and the government, as well as many high profile commentators, because they feel like their doubts and criticisms and concerns were not really being listened to, right? And so this is what happens when we cut the conversation off. We leave people feeling more distrustful of whatever the information that your side happens to be bringing to the table is. And so the next time a problem comes around where we need the American people to trust each other and to be in a good relationship with their institutions in order to be able to respond effectively, we just can't freaking do it because the well has been so poisoned, right? That the American people simply won't act as one to confront existential crises, right? Um, and so, it puts us in a terrible situation. And if we don't start to invest in building out those networks of trust now, while there's some space to maybe revisit some of these things, we're setting ourselves up to perhaps be in an even worse situation next time around. So that was a big part of the overall argument that I was making to Sam Harris.
Hmm.
Mm.
That makes a ton of sense. Well, Let's talk then a little bit about the reaction without getting super in the weeds, because I feel like there's weeds on weeds on weeds here.
No doubt.
You mentioned this guy posted a video of Sam speaking out of context, in which one could think he was suggesting that it was unlucky that more people didn't die from
Well,
COVID,
yeah,
when
and let
really
me,
he was.
yeah, and let me just say that from Alexandros's point of view, Sam was making an argument that didn't really make much sense to him. I don't think that he himself was necessarily trying to say that Sam wanted kids to, well, actually wanted kids to die, but the thing is that was an explosive line that he took and tweeted out.
Right.
I think knowing it was going to get attention. And so what happens in that case is that many people who do not have any interest in being particularly charitable take it to its most outrageous possible conclusion, right? And so I got hit with message after message and comment after comment saying Sam Harris is a monster who doesn't care if kids die. And again, that's just not the case in my view. So yeah, that happened, but then I responded to it sort of defending Sam's sort of, intentions as I saw them. And but the thing just continued to sort of blow up until, many popular commentators jumped in. And finally, Elon Musk himself jumped on the Twitter thread, commenting underneath the clip, saying something along the lines of, sounds like Sam hasn't come down from his ayahuasca trip because Sam is into psychedelics and so forth. And I think I responded to Elon Musk saying something like E2 Elon, like you're piling on too, man. So that clip wound up getting nearly, I think it's at about 4 million views on Twitter. And meanwhile, a number of, thousands and thousands of people have watched it, the interview on YouTube, but disproportionately, people have seen this clip. And, it
Mm.
just goes to the sensational nature of our politics in an ironic
It's
way
ironic
where,
in a way.
yeah, a conversation that was meant to be about, how do we rehumanize people in the discourse so we can engage each other in reasoned discussion with a recognition of context and so forth, became something that itself produced a soundbite that allowed people to demonize somebody for something that I don't think he really meant. And of course, got people furious all over the world, it seems. So that's the landscape that we're in, man, when we're dealing with Twitter and so on and so forth. But I do think that, it did drive a number of people to see the original conversation, to have some constructive dialogue on Twitter. I've interacted with some of the people who were, pretty vociferous in their condemnation of Sam and so forth. My hope is that this energy can ultimately find its way funneled towards a more constructive way of engaging. We already know that these pitfalls are there when we do things on Twitter, when we do things on YouTube, etc. So, on some level it comes with the territory, but I do think it's an opportunity to begin to steer people's attention towards this question of how do we have conversations that actually work? Because that's what we've got to place our hope in for a prosperous democratic future.
Mm.
Mm.
Well, let's end here by talking about the most recent episode, which I believe came out yesterday. Your interview with Kim Iverson. I guess, people should go watch and listen to the whole episode themselves, but without giving too many spoilers, John, is there anything you want to say to kind of set that up for people? Why should people go watch that one?
Yeah, well, Kim and I, first of all, we're longtime friends, and Kim, of course, Ciaran. We're all well known to each other here. And Kim Iverson, it was very popular. She's sort of a contrarian, left leaning activist. Supported Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, but has a lot of critical things to say about the left. But she's a populist. And what we talked about in this conversation was this basic question: is the divide in American society the most relevant divide, the left right divide? Or can we argue that the real divide in American society is between populists and the establishment, so to speak, right? And so that's kind of the subject we leaned into. Now, in that context, Kim also talked about the medical establishment, Dr. Anthony Fauci. Kim is coming from the complete opposite direction of Sam Harris in terms of how she sees the science and the things that played out during the high point of the COVID-19 pandemic. And she actually had sort of a controversial situation where she resigned from her position as a host on the very popular show, The Hill Rising, because they interviewed Anthony Fauci, but they didn't have her do the interview in her normal on the show that she had been co-host of, because she's such a fierce critic of Fauci. Everybody expected that she'd be the one to sort of grill him, but I guess they didn't want her to do that. So you can hear her talk about that experience in the episode. But the main focus was just sort of this question of, um, uh, what really divides us as a people? Is it just the ideology, or is it the fact that our predominating institutions have interests that, whether they're run by Democrats or Republicans, find themselves at odds with the interests of ordinary Americans, whether they happen to be conservatives or progressives? And so that's kind of the doorway into our dialogue. And yeah, I encourage folks to watch that one as well. Cam was engaging and electric, and we definitely have a conversation that breaks some ground.
Hmm. Well, last but not least, if you're comfortable teasing it a bit, anyone else coming down the pike that might be of interest to the audience?
Yes, indeed. Next week, a voice and face will be long familiar to many folks. Mr. Tavis Smiley, formerly of BET and PBS and NPR, and more recently, founder of KBLA and KBLA Talk Radio in Los Angeles, the only black owned political talk radio network west of the Mississippi River. Tavis Smiley is one of the most prominent and important journalists, an African American journalist, I think, in the history of the country. I mean, he's somebody whose career has really stretched out over a wide arc, and he's done a million fascinating things. We have a conversation about what it means to be black in America, and about different aspects of the Black freedom tradition, Black intellectual tradition that sort of looks at this question in different ways. We talk about, what common ground might there be between Black liberals and Black conservatives. What does it mean for Black people to be colorblind as opposed to race conscious? And all sorts of things, sort of digging into the race conversation, particularly from an African American vantage point, that highlights the fact that, as folks, are fond of saying oftentimes, that, Black is not a monolith. And we really dig into sort of the different perspectives of Black identity, and we challenge each other a bit, but also find a lot of common ground on not just sort of, the value of certain cultural experiences and understanding the differences that lie between them, but also, and very much in particular, about the ongoing and lasting importance of the legacy and teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. And so I very much encourage people to dig into that one, because we know, there's no more volatile subject than race in America, but also therefore no subject that perhaps carries with it a greater potential for healing if we can have those conversations in the right way.
Hmm. Well, I look forward to listening to that one. And if I'm lucky enough, I look forward to one day being a guest on the John Wood Jr. show, and perhaps sharing some of my progressive principles with the audience and being challenged by you in the right way.
We're keeping the seat warm for you, man. Get on down to LA, buddy. We'll make it happen.
I will. Well, once again, folks, it's called Uniting America with John Wood Jr. Go ahead and subscribe on whatever audio platform you use so that the episodes get automatically downloaded onto your device. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like, subscribe, and share. And also, please stay tuned to the Braver Angels podcast as we cast a new vision for the country and for the podcast, a new way of talking politics with balanced representation of voices from ordinary citizens to opinion shapers across the ideological spectrum. And with that, I say peace.